Hi everyone. So I'm going to talk about the relationships between psychedelics, empathy, and the prosocial behaviour of sharing. So first I'll take you through some of the neuropsychological evidence which has led me to believe that psychedelics increase empathy and prosocial behaviour. And then I'll talk about some of the clinical evidence that also supports this. And then I'll talk about my own project, which I completed as part of my honours year in psychology. And I also want to mention my supervisors, Dr. Ross Holler and Dr. Steve Bryant, who were super awesome and supportive of this study. And it was quite difficult for me to find a supervisor that would actually let me study this, so I just wanted to mention them as well. Ooh. All right, so in terms of the neuropsychological evidence, there are 3 reasons which have led me to believe that psychedelics increase empathy and prosocial behaviour. One of these is that psychedelics interact with the serotonin system as 5-HT2A receptor agonists. The second is that psychedelics deactivate the default mode network. And the third is that psychedelics increase neural connectivity. So in terms of the first piece of evidence that led me to believe that psychedelics increase empathy and prosocial behaviour, 5-HT modulates empathy. For example, Harmer and their colleagues found that participants administered citalopram, which is a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, detected facial expressions of happiness and fear faster and more accurately than participants who received a placebo. Also, the injection of serotonin agonists has promoted the release of oxytocin and vasopressin, which are neuropeptides implicated in empathy and other prosocial behaviours. For example, oxytocin has significantly increased correct responses to the reading the mind in the eyes test, which measures the empathic ability of participants to identify and understand the emotional states of others. So because the serotonin system plays a role in moderating empathic responses, and because psychedelics agonize serotonin receptors, psychedelics could play a role in the moderation of empathic functioning and predict empathy. In terms of the second piece of neuropsychological evidence that led me to believe that psychedelics increase empathy and prosocial behaviour, they deactivate the default mode network. And so this is a set of brain regions that are active during rest or during less demanding tasks. So as you pay more attention to a task, activity within the default mode network decreases. Some of these brain regions include the medial prefrontal cortex, the posterior cingulate cortex, and the temporoparietal junction. And so some of the things that the default mode network is involved in, amongst other things, is helping people to develop a clear sense of their self or ego, and also self-referential processing and rumination. So self-referential processing refers to the cognitive process of relating information to the self, and rumination is a type of self-referential processing which is characterised by repetitive thinking and a focus on negative mood states. So 2 psychedelics, LSD and psilocybin, decreased activity in the default mode network, and these decreases correlated with ego dissolution. So ego dissolution could be defined as disintegrating of the self, and where the boundary between the self and the other is blurred. And so one study that talked about decreased activity in the default mode network found that intravenous administration of 2 milligrams of psilocybin decreased activity in the posterior cingulate cortex, which forms a central part of the default mode network. And these decreases in the default mode network correlated with ratings of the item, "I experienced a disintegration of myself or ego." In other words, decreased activity in the default mode network by psilocybin led to feelings that the border between the self and the world was dissolving. Additionally, Carhart-Harris and their colleagues found that intravenous administration of 75 micrograms of LSD significantly decreased activity in the default mode network in contrast to participants who received a placebo. Again, these decreases correlated with ego dissolution. So if psychedelics blur the boundary between the self and the other, individuals who use psychedelics might share more due to valuation of benefits to others in addition to benefits to the self. Similarly, blurring of the self and the other could mean that people might better understand or share the emotional state of another person, leading to an increase in empathic behaviour. The third piece of neuropsychological evidence that led me to believe that psychedelics could facilitate empathy and sharing is that LSD administration has increased connectivity between parts of the brain associated with self-awareness and emotional processing. And two of these areas that LSD has increased connectivity between were the bilateral insular cortex and the bilateral insular cortex and the bilateral temporoparietal junction. And so activation of the bilateral insular has been found to correlate with awareness of personal agency in negative social situations. So that is, increased bilateral insular activity was observed where participants assumed and accepted responsibility for causing a negative social event, thus demonstrating a non-self-serving bias. So as psychedelics activate and connect brain regions associated with self-awareness and the processing of social information, this could in turn lead to less self-centric thinking, and it is thus plausible that people who use psychedelics may exhibit increased empathic functioning and subsequent sharing behaviour. So now I'll talk to you about some of the clinical evidence that supports direct relationships between psychedelics and empathy. So Lerner and Livers found that people who had used psychedelics scored higher in emotional empathy than people who hadn't. And this was measured by the Emotional Empathic Tendency Scale, which measures one's perceived ability to identify and feel the emotions of others. Also, Dolder and their colleagues found that single doses of 100 and 200 micrograms of LSD enhanced emotional empathy as measured by the multifaceted empathy test, which required participants to view photographs of others and rate how much they were feeling for each individual in the photograph. And Pokorny and their colleagues conducted a randomized controlled trial where psilocybin was administered to healthy participants. Significant increases in emotional empathy were demonstrated, again as measured by the multifaceted empathy test. And furthermore, Grob and their colleagues administered 0.2 milligrams per kilogram of psilocybin to advanced stage cancer patients and found that empathic rapport increased through strengthened relationships with friends and family following the dose. In terms of prosocial behaviour and the clinical evidence, Schmidt and Liechty supported a causal direction between LSD use and altruism through longitudinal research. So for participants who received LSD, self-reported altruism ratings, as measured by the Persisting Effects Questionnaire, had significantly increased at 1 and 12 months following the dose. And this questionnaire assesses changes in prosocial attitudes and behaviours. Also, Griffiths and their colleagues found that participants given a high dose of psilocybin exhibited significantly greater increases in prosocial attitudes and behaviours than participants given a low dose of psilocybin. And this was measured 6 months following the dose. Another thing that I looked at in my study was the personality trait of openness. And I looked at this because there was a lot of research that suggested that psychedelics increased openness, and this personality trait encompasses broad-minded tolerance of others' values and viewpoints, aesthetic appreciation, imagination, and fantasy. And so some of the clinical evidence showed that psychedelics increased openness. So, for example, McLean and their colleagues found significant increases in openness following a 30 milligram per 70 kilograms dose of psilocybin, which was sustained 6 months following the dose. Barbosa and their colleagues found UDV members in Brazil with ayahuasca experience scored significantly higher on the openness subscale of the Big Factor Inventory, which is a scale or a questionnaire that measures personality traits, including openness, than matched controls with no ayahuasca experience. Lebedev and their colleagues found that openness significantly increased 2 weeks after a dose. And interestingly, this was the first study to demonstrate personality changes in healthy adults following a single manipulated event. So in terms of my study, my hypotheses were that psychedelic substance use history would predict empathy after controlling for age and gender, and that psychedelic substance use history would predict sharing after controlling for age and gender. So I had 421 participants. There were more females than males. More than half of my sample had admitted to using a psychedelic at least once in their life, and about a third of the sample said that they had used psychedelics in the past year. So LSD was the most commonly reported psychedelic used, followed by psilocybin and those other psychedelics listed there. And then in terms of use of psychedelics in the past year, it's the same order of psychedelics. So LSD was the most popular, followed by psilocybin, and then DMT, mescaline, ayahuasca, and 5-MeO-DMT. So to measure empathy and sharing in my study, I had an online questionnaire. So for empathy, I used an already existing questionnaire to measure empathic tendencies. So participants would be given a statement and have to say how well that statement applies to them. So for example, when I see someone get hurt, I tend to remain calm. For sharing, I had an online dictator game. So participants were given raffle tickets, which they could either keep, give, or share with the other hypothetical player. So this is just a screenshot from the questionnaire that shows that they're given this many raffle tickets, and then they just select how many that they want to keep and how many, and that the others will go to the other player. To measure personality, I incorporated the Big Five inventory, which measures personality traits, including openness. And so people are given the start of a sentence. I see myself as someone who, for example, values artistic, aesthetic experiences. And so that is an example of openness, which is what I was specifically interested in. Here are my results. The PT, FS, EC, PD on the side there, the empathy variables. As you can see, not very significant. The one significant thing actually showed that people who hadn't used psychedelics scored slightly higher in one of the parts of empathy than people who had. So that was a bit of a bummer. This is the correlations. So there's a few significant relationships there, but most of them are weak. There was a significant relationship between openness and past year use, which was exciting. So I did find a significant relationship between openness and past year psychedelic use, but not between empathy and sharing. And I think there's a few reasons for this. Most of the research were actually clinical trials where they knew exactly what the psychedelic was, the dosage, whereas my sample was in an unregulated context where people didn't know what their dosage was. They didn't know, maybe they didn't know if it was a psychedelic, because it's hard to be sure of that when it's unregulated. And also there's lots of research that says intention behind the experience and dosage is important. So a high dose is probably important. And also the type of experience is super important. So there's lots of research that suggests that the mystical experience, so transcendence of time and space, feelings of oneness with others in the world, ego dissolution, that this is the kind of experience that you need to have to actually increase empathy and prosocial behaviour. And I didn't actually measure that in my study because of the constraints of the short time that I had to do it. But it would have been interesting to include a scale such as the mysticism scale to actually measure the type of experience and see if that what led to empathy and prosocial behaviour. And also the dictator game that I used wasn't very realistic, and lots of people came up to me and were like, oh, I didn't really understand what was going on. I didn't believe that there were raffle tickets that go into a drawer, and I knew there was no other person there, so that kind of reduced the validity for sharing. And that's it.
Thanks, Emily. We have time for questions. If I could get people who have questions just to come and line up down here, that'd be great. Yep. I just want to start off by saying congratulations on actually doing psychedelic research in Australia, first of all, because you're one of a few. And it's very hard to get anything done. And I think you've pointed out greatly there what are the impacts of not being able to do the research clinically here as well, right? And I guess, as you pointed out a little bit, I think it's great to hear just how well in a clinical setting, it's great to have these naturalistically and for people to use them themselves in an intent, like with good intention, but to know that the people that don't actually have the knowledge or are coming in from maybe to treat depression and we're going to bring them into a clinic at some stage, we can actually reliably induce those mystical experiences in a very predictable manner. And as you say, the lead to great changes in people. So I think it's really good to be able to see what you've done and how that different clinical setting weighs in there. You had a question down here?
I was curious as to whether you saw the potential for psychedelics to be a non or quite or very specific amplifier of the Extinction Rebellion.
What's the Extinction Rebellion?
Dave Nichols. Extinction Rebellion is the movement to stop the global overheating.
Oh, right. Okay, so you think that psychedelics could facilitate like greater awareness of
Well, I was just wondering, given the nature of your research.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think that could definitely help people to feel closer to the world. So as part of the mystical experience, that is a feeling at one with the world. So I think that could definitely help people to become more aware of climate change and the impacts of that in extinction, for sure. Yep.
Any other questions? I think there was actually a study that came out showing that, right?
Oh, really?
Yeah, there was actually a study showing that people who take psychedelics have actually greater connection to the environment. And
yeah. I did see that one. Yep.
Yeah, I thought that. So
yeah,
yes, your
with
question's
others
spot
and
on.
the environment. Yeah.
Well, let's move on from there, and we'll
Cool.
thank you for your talk, Emily. It was really interesting to see. Round of applause for Emily.